As we continue, we also asked Professor Gabrielle Bammer to do a keynote. She is professor at the National Centre for Epidemiology and Population Health at the Australian National University. She is developing the new discipline of Integration and Implementation Sciences, and it aims to improve and interweave the research and action linkage on complex real-world problems by providing new concepts and methods to A, bring together knowledge from relevant disciplines and stakeholders, B, understand and manage diverse unknowns, and C, support policy and practice change. Great to have you with us, Gabrielle Bammer.
Thank you, and thank you so much for the opportunity to join you at this celebration of what has really been a fantastic amount of work. It's been a great opening to the conference that I've really enjoyed. Essentially, what I'm going to do is reinforce the messages that you've just heard from Salim Hook. Essentially, what I've been trying to do is to capture those lessons that he talked about in a way that makes them more palatable to an academic audience. And that's really what I want to share with you today. So I'm going to talk about four things. I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction to integration and implementation sciences, which I've been working on for quite a long time. I'm going to talk about its relevance to research on deltas. I'm then going to move on to talk about key elements of complex problems and then finish with talking about expertise in integration and implementation sciences. So in essence, I'm arguing that what we need is a discipline, and that's what integration and implementation sciences sets out to be, that provides and develops concepts, methods and processes for dealing with complex societal and environmental problems. For some reason, my PowerPoint has taken on a life of its own. Can you please stop doing that so that I can share my screen myself? I'm particularly interested in how do we synthesize disciplinary and stakeholder knowledge? How do we understand and manage unknowns? And how do we support policy and practice change? So how do we bring together what we know and what we don't know so that we can more effectively use our research to help policymakers and practitioners to work with them, as Salim Hook said, to work with them effectively to make change happen. And to give you a graphic, this is the graphic that I'll use from now on. So it's about bringing together different kinds of knowledge. It's about understanding and managing diverse unknowns, and it's about policy and practice change. So the aim, oh man, this is going to drive me crazy if the slides keep going ahead of my talking. The aim of I2S is to underpin inter and transdisciplinary research, post-normal science, systems thinking, and so on. And I've given you an overview here of the different kinds of ways of tackling complex societal and environmental problems that integration and implementation sciences aims to underpin. And so what I'm arguing is that these areas, interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, and so on, have systems thinking, action research, post-normal science. They're all trying to do the same thing. They have very strong overlaps, but currently there are no ways in which they can share similar concepts. So what we have is a whole lot of reinventing of the wheel. No existing discipline has this aim, and dear, no existing discipline has this aim, and so what I2S aims to do is to really provide that underpinning linkage between all these different ways that have been developed to I'm just wondering if there's something wrong with my PowerPoint, that it's on some sort of an automatic feed. Let me just stop for a minute and see if I can check that. No, it's probably not going to work. So I'll just have to talk faster to keep up with my... So I'm sorry about that. This is difficult. All right. So I2S is trying to provide a common linkage between a whole range of different perspectives that are trying to work together to work on complex societal and environmental problems. So if your research is on deltas, is aiming to bring together knowledge from different disciplines and from stakeholders, if you're trying to deal with the unknown, and if you're trying to support policy and practice change, then I2S sets out to help you. And what it aims to do is it aims to help you find what you need. It aims to help you find out what you don't know that you need. It aims to help you improve the quality of what you're trying to do. And it aims to be a conduit for sharing what you've learned. So not only what you've learned in Delta's research, but also in other kinds of research that you might have done. And Delta's research can be shared with people doing public health research or research on security. And you can also learn lessons from their research that can help you improve the concepts and methods that you use. So the aim is for I2S and Delta's research to thrive together. All right, so let me talk a little bit about, so having talked about it very generally, let me talk about, to get more specific. And I should say that I'm going to provide a lot of information. The idea is to give you a flavour of what integration and implementation sciences is trying to do. And hopefully there'll be some hooks in there that tie into the work that you're doing. So I'm going to begin by talking about complex problems and the key elements. So I'm going to argue that there are 6 things that make a problem complex. The first is that complex problems are systems problems. And by that, I mean that they have non-existent boundaries, they have feedback loops, they are can be non-linear, there are delays, which mean that you can't predict when things are going to happen. There are tipping points, all these things that people who understand systems problems will know about and that you need to take into account. So we're not talking about linear cause and effect, but we're talking about a much more complicated way in which everything connects to everything else in the problem. And what that means is that the problems that we're talking about have no clearly defined limits. We have to put limits on the problem because otherwise we couldn't deal with them, but the limits are defined by humans. They're not defined within the system itself. The second element of complex problems is diversity. And what I mean by this is that what's relevant to understanding the problem are different disciplinary perspectives, different stakeholder perspectives, and then a whole range of things that make us who we are. So all our different values, our different interests, our different cultures, our different personalities, all of those things come into play when we're talking about complex problems. And what that means is that no problem has a very clear definition because each of us, depending on our discipline, depending on what kind of a stakeholder group we might be representing, depending on who we are, what our values are, will define the problem differently. The third thing that makes a problem complex is that it's changing all the time. And there are some things about change that are really important. So we all work in an environment that's changing all the time. Some of us might be working in an environment where there's major change. Some of us might be working in problems that are in a quiet backwater where there's not much going on, where we have a lot more time. That if we want things to stay the same, continuity and conservation also require effort, require work. The third thing about change that's important is that we have inbuilt inertia or resistance to change so that once something exists, it can be really hard to get rid of. The fourth thing is that change doesn't necessarily lead to improvement. Indeed, success is in the eye of the beholder. And finally, once you try to make change happen, the outcomes of your attempt to influence change are unpredictable. And what that means is that control is a necessary illusion, but it's also a dangerous one. So we have to believe that we're in control, but actually we're not. The fourth element of complexity is context. So by this, I mean the relevant historical, cultural, political, economic, and other circumstances in which the problem and the research exists. Who gives us authorization to do the research and to try to make change happen? And what are the institutional settings in which we're working, and how do they facilitate or make harder the kind of research that we're trying to do and the change that we're trying to make happen? And what the context means is that there are multiple constraints on what is feasible to do. The fifth element is the unknown. And I'm going to give you my favourite metaphor here, which is the island of knowledge in the ocean of unknowns. So imagine that unknowns are an infinite ocean, and that knowledge, what we know, is this island in that ocean. Think about the shoreline. So the more we know, the greater the shoreline gets. And the shoreline is what we know we don't know. So the more we know, the more we also become aware of what we don't know. Understanding the unknown is something we're not very good at, and it's something we need to get much better at. We need to understand that unknowns are infinite, as I've said, because we've got continuous innovation in research, and research doesn't just take unknowns away, it always creates new ones as well. We've got irreducible unknowns, we've got limited methods for dealing with unknowns, and unknowns are also have benefits, so we don't want to get rid of them. So while unknowns are infinite, research capacity is finite, and so we will always have unknowns. It's also important to understand what we mean by unknowns. So if in this very simple matrix, there are 4 or 3 types of unknowns. There's what we know we don't know, our conscious ignorance in the top right-hand corner. There's what we don't know we know, our tacit knowledge. And there's what we don't know we don't know, the things that really can come and give us really nasty surprises. So multiple unknowns mean that we're ill-equipped to, there are multiple unknowns that we're ill-equipped to handle, and that can lead to surprises and adverse unintended consequences. And we have to be better at ameliorating those potential problems. So the final element of complexity is a result of all of the others, and that is imperfection. So because systems don't have boundaries, because we have to take so much diversity into account, because there's always change, because context matters, because there will always be unknowns, we can never get perfect answers. And what that means is that solutions to problems can only ever be partial and temporary. So there will always, as I've said, be some aspects of the problem that are unresolved, and there will always be some people who are unhappy with the decisions made. And so we can never have perfection. And what we have to aim for is trade-offs. What's the best that we can do in the circumstances? So let me move then from that kind of broad perspective on complexity to talking about specifics, the kinds of expertise that an integration and implementation specialist would try to develop. So there are 2 kinds of expertise that are relevant. And in all of these slides that follow, on the left-hand side of the slide, under the heading, I also provide references for anybody who's interested. And the PDF of the slides is available. I've sent it to the conference organisers, or you can also ask me for them. I'm very happy to share the references. So back to expertise. One kind of expertise that's important is contributory expertise, which is our ability to make a substantive contribution to concepts, methods, or processes for tackling complex problems. And this is about what we know, and know how to do things. The second kind of expertise, which I'm only going to mention briefly, is that we need to have the ability to understand disciplines, professional practices, and community experiences without having been trained in those professions and disciplines or having lived in those communities. That we need to be able to quickly cotton on to what's going on. And that involves, as Salimul said, a lot of talking to communities. So who should have this kind of expertise? So should everybody have it? I'd argue that that's probably unrealistic, and that what everybody should know is that this set of expertise exists and how to find people who've got it. And I'd argue that we need to have specialists who know how to do this kind of work, and those specialists would be the people who are trained in integration and implementation sciences. So what is this expertise? I'd suggest that there are 11 things that an integration and implementation sciences specialist needs to have: concepts, methods, and processes to address. So the first 5 we've already done: systems, diversity, change, context, and unknowns. They also need to be good at understanding how to communicate effectively, another point that Salimul Huq made. They need to know how to work together in teams and how to make teamwork effective. They need to know how to work effectively with stakeholders. They need to be able to integrate all those different kinds of knowledge and integrate unknowns. They need to be able to provide decision support to policymakers and practitioners, and they need to be able to implement the research that they do. So I'm going to give you some examples very quickly of what this kind of expertise looks like. So, and I'm not going to go through each of the 11 topics. I'm going to have a few on some things and nothing on others. But I just want to give you a flavour of what this expertise looks like. So Laura Schmidt-Olabisi says, you know, the great thing about systems is that you can intervene anywhere in the system, and you don't have to be powerful to intervene in the system. Ordinary people can intervene in systems too. And so systems are actually a great method for empowerment. Shalaman Schwartz has developed this great way of understanding values. And when we want to think about diversity in values is one of the things that we have to understand. So he's developed this overview of values, which he argues works culturally for across the world. And he argues that there are these different values that are important for different of us. So for some of us, self-enhancement is important, so we're interested in power and achievement. For some of us, self-transcendence is important, so we're interested in benevolence and universalism and helping others. Some of us are open to change, so we're interested in stimulation. Some of us are very conservative, so we're interested in security and conformity and tradition. And this is a great way of starting to understand where value conflicts come from. And once you understand value conflicts, you're in a better position to be able to deal with them. The other interesting thing about diversity is that you need good facilitation skills to deal with it. And I want to show you this because it was a revelation to me, and I'm sure many of you have been in group meetings where you've had this experience of what's called the groan zone. So when a group gets together, a diverse group gets together, there's this initial excitement where everybody shares their views and you learn all these new things from people, and that's on the left-hand side of this graph. So the bit that's over here that looks like that. So you get this flowering of ideas, and it's very exciting. And then all of a sudden you have to pull all these ideas together and do something with them. And for that, you need that's when you enter the groan zone, and it's, oh my goodness, what are we going to do now? How are we going to pull it together? How are we going to get to this other side of convergence of all these different ideas? And having some skills to do that is really important. Understanding the situation is important too. There's also some great work that's been done by Manala Farah from Egypt on how facilitation skills can improve leadership, and she works through a range of ways that facilitation and leadership can reinforce each other. There's some terrific work being done by David Lamb and a group from Germany about amplifying change. So I'm going to move on to change now. So once we've made change happen on a small scale, how do we amplify it? How do we make it larger? How do we expand its reach? And David and a group of people have come together and thought about different ways of doing this. So one way is to do the same thing longer or faster, do more of the same. The other is to do it in different contexts, in different ways. And the third is to really try and revolutionize things, to change rules and values. So there's some great work here that people can draw on. Let's move on to unknowns. So a colleague of mine, Mike Smithson from Australia, is really one of the pioneers in thinking about the unknown. And he's written about the 4 things that everybody should know about ignorance, and also about how do we get handles on what we don't know. And there are actually some really effective ways that we can do that I don't really have time to go into. If we move on to teamwork, there's some terrific work that's been done in the US about collaboration principles and team science principles. So building trust, building a shared vision, using emotional intelligence, and a range of other steps that are really necessary to make teams work well. There's also some terrific work that's being done now on decolonizing knowledge. So this is a group from Bolivia who've done some work on how researchers can work with Indigenous knowledge in a way that's respectful and that really helps that Indigenous knowledge inform what's going on. They've developed this tool called the Circle of Dialogue Wisdom. Moving on to stakeholder engagement, there's some work that I've done. There's a stakeholder primer series that I've developed. And as part of that, I've been thinking about what are the different options for working with stakeholders? Because while it might be ideal to co-create with them, that's not always possible. So what can we do if that's not possible? What other options are there? And how do we do that effectively? So how do we effectively consult? How do we effectively interact? How do we effectively inform? And then moving beyond collaboration, if stakeholders are in a position to do their own research, how can researchers effectively work with them to do that? There's also great work on stakeholder engagement that's come out of Africa from Kenya and Nigeria about how to get stakeholders involved early, so that, again, a point that Salim Ul-Hook made is to work with them throughout the process so that you're more likely to get change to happen. How do we make integration happen? So again, this is work that I've done about using dialogue methods to do research integration, and various kinds of dialogue methods and how they can be used. How do we implement research? So how can early career researchers work with policymakers, for example? I've lost a couple of slides. That's annoying. I must have hit the delete button. There were a couple of other slides about effective ways of doing research implementation. So let me come back to the point that I made earlier about the relevance to research on deltas. So if your research requires stakeholder engagement and integrating across disciplines, if it requires dealing with unknowns, if it requires trying to support policy and practice change, then integration and implementation sciences aims to help you find what you need, to find out what you don't know that you need, and to improve the quality of what you do, and to share what you've learned. And as I've said, ideally we can thrive together, and I hope that we can do that. If you're interested in finding out more, what I've presented comes from the 2 websites at the top. The first of those is a website with a bunch of resources that we write and produce.
Here's the Q&A, yeah?
Sorry. The second is a blog, the Integration and Implementation Insights blog, i2insights.org, which is where people can contribute a whole lot of ideas. We have a LinkedIn group. We have a YouTube channel, which has a range of videos that show various of these techniques in action. We have a Twitter account where we tweet about new resources as we put them online. And finally, my email address, and I'd be delighted to interact with any of you who care to email. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle. I'm sorry for interrupting you at the end.
That's all right.
A lot to unpack. We have some questions on screen, and I'll just go to the first question. Should integration and implementation expertise be found in specific persons? In brackets, this is very demanding. Or should it be built in research institutions and projects in a more structural way?
That's a really good question. So yes, you're right. For any one person to be able to do all of this is a lot. But at the moment, we expect everybody who's a researcher in this kind of area to be able to do it. And so it makes more sense to get some people to specialise in it. But it, as you say, it absolutely needs to have structural support. So people need to have these skills, but they need to be supported in contributing those skills to teams.
Okay. Another question is, how would an ideal team look like to tackle research on a specific delta issue? For instance, subsiding deltas due to groundwater extraction.
So my suggestion is that you would have the relevant disciplinary experts who know about the specific aspects of the problem, but you would also have one or more integration and implementation scientists who can help those disciplinary experts bring their knowledge together in a way that makes the whole greater than the sum of the parts, and who can help the interaction with stakeholders so that the stakeholder knowledge is appropriately brought into the valued and respected and brought to bear, that they can help think about what we don't know so that we're not only dealing with the unknowns that, so disciplines, if you like, are defined by the unknowns that they deal with. But problems come with different kinds of unknowns as well as the ones that the disciplines are interested in. So we have to be able to bring those other unknowns into the picture. Otherwise, we get unintended consequences and nasty surprises. And then you want to be able to help the team make a difference, right? You want all that research to support, inform policy and practice change. And so the integration and implementation sciences specialists should have the knowledge to help broker relationships with policymakers and practitioners throughout the project, if that's possible, but at least at the end when there are results to support policy and practice change with. So, and understanding the benefits of different ways of interacting. So in my suggestion would be that a team would have a range of diversity on it, and then somebody who knows how to bring all that diversity together.
So that brings me to another question. I see a smile on your face. You've been pointing towards a lot of research, young people, older people, Africa, different continents, and they all have great suggestions. But I'm going to ask you very honestly and to be frank, with all your expertise, how do we get the actual policymakers and project coordinators to listen to what you suggest or what others suggest, and that those scientists or individuals that come up with new ideas to engage with stakeholders, that they write the report and it somehow disappears in the office, never to be found again? So
I guess we have to value it for a start. And I think one of the impressive things about this project is the amount of effort that's gone into implementation. Somehow we think that if we pay researchers to do the research, the rest will somehow happen by magic, but of course it won't. You need to have concerted effort to make change happen, right? I guess the challenge is moving out of the honest broker research phase into a much more political action phase. And whose job is it to do that? I think what the wonderful work that Salimul talked about on climate change is a great example of that tension between being an honest broker and doing great research and really looking at the problem without fear or favour, and then trying to get policy and practice change to happen. There are no perfect, part of the reason why I stress imperfection is that there are no perfect answers. And If you're lucky, you'll be working on a problem when policymakers actually want to make something happen. If you're not lucky, you've got to convince them that you need to make change. And that's what we see with climate change all the time, right? And that's true for a lot of other problems too. So there are no perfect ways forward here, but we now have growing experience of researchers engaging with policymakers. And what I2S really tries to do is to capture that experience so that we can learn from it and not keep repeating over and over again.
Thank you so much. And what I learned is that you never know what you don't know. That's a really important takeaway from what you said today. Thank you so much. That was Gabrielle Bammer. We will be going to a short break and we'll be back with more. See you later.